Architectural Outcast.
Welcome to the Architectural Outcast introduction to the architecture of Crimson Desert. Pearl Abyss does something very smart with their world building, and by extension, their architecture. They establish a baseline of known expectations, and then through the introduction of magic and medieval steampunk, would it be medieval punk? I don't know. Let's just call it steampunk. They start messing with those expectations. The first place you encounter in the game is Hernand, which looks like an Italian hill town with a castle looming over it and the people wearing Italian Renaissance-inspired outfits. Without the developers having to say a word, you already know this is a pre-industrial world with a feudal government. Sure enough, as soon as you walk into town, you have cobblestone streets, medieval-looking buildings, armored guards carrying bladed weapons. You have the ubiquitous inn, along with other merchant shops. You already know how to interact with this world without the developers having to say a single word. Pywel doesn't feel like it needs the player to exist. Pearl Abyss avoids this mistake through their design of the built environment. The architecture, which is key, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there's another equally important element of the built environment, the infrastructure that allows the architecture to exist in the first place. The cobblestone streets have gutters that lead to a sewer system that would be capable of handling all the water running down the hillside of a hillside town. Next to almost every town are farms, showing how all the people of Pywel are being fed. There are also ranches, fisheries, tanneries, sawmills. We'll come back to that one, trust me. Weavers, dye shops, all of the industries that would be needed to support an advanced pre-industrial society. There are even outhouses. Outside of being funny, this level of detail matters. Since I've started doing these video game architecture critiques, a common question I get is, how would people go to the bathroom in game X? You say, it's a game. It's not real. Who cares where they go to the bathroom? When you build a world, the last thing you want is for the audience to start asking, how would something happen questions. It means they're questioning the believability of your world. When it comes to the architecture, Pearl Abyss did a pretty good job understanding three things that are of particular importance when it comes to pre-industrial architecture. The weather that the architecture has to deal with, the materials readily available in the area to build the architecture, and the culture that creates the architecture. Hernand is in a forested, rocky, hilly region, so it would make sense that its architecture is primarily made out of stone with a lot of wood elements. Hernand's vegetation indicates a region with distinct seasons with wide-ranging temperatures and a good deal of moisture. And Hernand's architecture matches this environment. It's weather-tight and sturdy, capable of withstanding rain, wind, and snow loads. As far as culture, this is where Hernand gets interesting, because it's a blending of Tuscan hill town and English Tudor architecture. When you move north to Pywel, you find a cold, heavily forested, rugged, mountainous region that definitely deals with a lot of snow. The architecture in the region fits its environment, sturdy and low with steep roofs, primarily made out of wood, timber, and boards. We'll come back to those boards in a bit. Pywel's social structure is portrayed as being much more loose and decentralized, so the frontier vibe of the architecture makes sense. I'll be addressing this in greater detail in future videos on the architecture of Crimson Desert. Pearl Abyss is having to balance audience expectations with historic accuracy, And what we're seeing with Pywel's architecture is that expectation is winning out over accuracy. Wood and decentralized societies don't equal crude architecture. Celtic, Germanic peoples, Anglo-Saxons, Scandinavians, their architecture had just as complex an engineering as anything the Greeks or Romans ever built. The problem is, because they were made out of wood, the only thing left are holes in the ground. Contemporary accounts from the Greeks and Romans themselves described an awe-inspiring architecture. It's argued that this architecture is what inspired the Gothic cathedral. Unfortunately, most people don't know the correct history. They've been taught wood plus decentralized society equals crude architecture. And for the sake of meeting expectations and narrative clarity, Pearl Abyss created Pywel as we see it. The kingdom of Demonis is located in a flat central plain covered in farms and managed forest. The vegetation indicates a more moderate climate, but you still have distinct seasons and quite a bit of moisture. You have a society with advanced technology, gunpowder, and this is where we start getting into the steampunk elements. The government is a monarchy with strong centralized power. Demonis' architecture feels like medieval Paris, which just so happened to be located in a central plain covered in farmland and managed forest, with a society that was technologically advanced for its time period and ruled over by a powerful monarch. So it all adds up. Moving on to Teshkalop, we're in a rugged, dry, dusty region with scraggly vegetation. This city is tapping into the roots of architecture. These are some of the first building types that humans ever made. This could be Ur or Jericho or ancient Baghdad or any number of cities that we've found across the Fertile Crescent. In an environment with limited wood and even usable stone, people use what they have available: dirt, mud brick, adobe, whatever you want to call it. Because what wood they do have access to is small and short, the buildings themselves stay small. This is a society living on the edge of survival. And then there's Varnia, a city built in a hidden oasis in the mountains on the edge of the desert. The architecture is basically the same thing that we find in Teshkalop, but instead of being made out of mud brick, it's made out of stone. And because it's an affluent society, they can afford to tart it up. One of the themes of Crimson Desert is the lost knowledge of ancient civilizations. We've only learned enough to have a glimpse into what ancient Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, and the other ancient cities in the region were like. Varnia is allowing us to tap into our cultural fascination with that era, our ancient roots. It allows us to imagine just for a moment what it might have been like to roam those ancient streets. The Abyss's architecture also plays with the themes of lost ancient knowledge, but these themes are dependent upon the audience's expectations. The architecture is a blending of classical Greek-Roman elements, Renaissance elements, and completely alien elements. Most people associate Greek and Roman architecture with wisdom, knowledge, tradition. Renaissance architecture with reason, enlightenment, development of the scientific method. And then you throw in the alien elements, and it tells you, well, this isn't really Greek or Roman or Renaissance. It must be something even older. Throw in the overgrown, unkempt vegetation, and the perception of ancient wisdom is complete. The only thing missing is Indiana Jones fighting off the baddies to get to the really good stuff. Back to Hernand. Another smart thing that Pearl Abyss does is they have a very clear hierarchy in their architecture. The elite live in large, well-built, and well-maintained buildings with fancy, ornate details. The interiors are luxurious, with whitewashed walls, carved paneling and other wood elements, parquet floors, paintings, fancy furniture. When you take a step down to the townsfolk, the middle class, merchants and such, their houses are equally well built and just as well maintained, but they're simple, without all the ornamentation. The theme repeats itself in the interiors, a simpler, less ornate version of what we already saw in the wealthy houses. Then there are the houses of the working class, farmers and such. They're smaller, little more run down, less well maintained, starting to look a little shabby. The interiors are another step down, a little cruder, little rougher, little less organized. And then you have poor people's houses, made out of wood, shoddy construction, dilapidated, run down. Interiors are crude, scruffy, and dirty. You even have gaps in the walls. This is the point where we need to address some of the mistakes that Pearl Abyss made, because it's not all gravy. Now, in Pearl Abyss's defense, some of these mistakes are common to video games. At this point, they're almost tropes. Most of the interiors have too much space between all the stuff. This is mostly technological. You have to deal with things like collision, clipping, where your camera's going to be, and Pearl Abyss's camera is not that good. And then you have problems coming about because of aesthetic or stylistic choices, like the roofs all over Hernand with ragged edges. The tile doesn't go to the edge of the roof. This would cause two major problems. Long term, that wood would rot, meaning the roof would collapse because those tiles ain't light. The second, more immediate problem, because the tiles don't go to the edge of the roof would leak like a sieve all along the wall, which means the house would be uninhabitable. And pretty much every house outside of the wealthy houses in Hernand has the same roof line. Every house in Hernand would be uninhabitable. I don't know what Pearl Abyss was thinking, but this was an unforced error, particularly egregious because the rest of the building is pretty well designed. Speaking of roofs, Pearl Abyss makes a common mistake that you see in many medieval-inspired games, like Oblivion and Skyrim, just to name two. I'm talking about the roof repair with the boards nailed all higgledy-piggledy. This is worse than the leak itself because doing this traps the water up on the roof. We see this type of repair everywhere in the game. And beyond the fact that it does less than nothing to solve the problem, it's supposed to be symbolic, representing the struggles of the poor, how they're forced to live in lower quality houses, often made out of wood, and then when those houses start to fall apart, they're forced to use low-quality materials, wood, to repair those houses. And that gets to a much deeper issue, a failure to understand how medieval-based societies were very different than our society today. That brings us to the problem of the board itself. Boards are a product of the Industrial Revolution. In medieval times, boards were very rare. Now, before I start on a diatribe about the inaccuracies of boards in a medieval setting, Pearl Abyss addresses this issue. They have sawmills. They even show logging on an industrial scale as well. And this helps with another part of the world building as well. It shows the land being cleared for more farmland, giving the sense that this is a living, breathing world that's moving at its own pace that doesn't depend upon the player to exist. So Pearl Abyss accounts for the existence of boards in a medieval type setting. They even show the manufacture of the furniture that we see in all the houses. So that architectural outcast guy can't be ranting and raving about boards existing in this world, right? But here's the deeper problem. Pearl Abyss shows that the boards are still being made by hand. Even the bandsaw is shown to be hand operated, which means producing boards is going to be labor intensive, which further means they're not going to be cheap. Leastways cheap enough to become the default building material of the poor. Let's accept on good faith that Pearl Abyss has done enough, that the logging camps and sawmills prove that boards would be readily available in this world and cheap enough that they would become the de facto building material for poor people's houses. There are still two major problems. The first one, the boards that are laid on every single road all across Pywel. The logistics of this are mind-boggling. Cutting down and processing all the trees, and then the infrastructure to lay all of it, and then you'd have to repeat it every 2 to 3 years because the wood would rot away. And why would you do this in the first place? It doesn't make the roads better, it actively makes them worse. First off, the irregular, uneven surface, you're looking at breaking the legs of horses, oxen, and all your other draft animals, not to mention the people trying to walk on the roads. And anybody who's ever walked on wet, muddy wood knows it's way more dangerous than walking on wet, muddy ground. So again, why would you go through all the effort to do this? That brings us to the second issue. All the stuff just laying around. Now, in Pearl Abyss's defense, this is a mistake that a lot of video game developers make. To the point, it's another one of those tropes. Everywhere you look, there's detritus, stuff left out and allowed to rot away. There's no rhyme or reason why all of this stuff exists in the first place, much less being left out in the weather to deteriorate. In medieval Europe, and pretty much every other pre-industrial society, people didn't own a lot of things. It's because everything had to be handmade, which means labor and time. That meant things had value. They weren't allowed to just sit out and rot away. They were used and reused until they couldn't be used anymore. That's when they were thrown away. Having so much stuff that it loses value and thus becomes disposable is a modern mindset, which is very different from the way medieval people thought. I'm going to wrap it up there. Crimson Desert's world is so big, this has just been a broad overview, an introduction to its architecture. I'm going to do further videos going into greater depth on each region and town's architecture. If you all enjoy this type of architectural critique, like the video, subscribe, consider becoming a channel member. At any rate, I hope I gave you all something to think about, and until next time, you all be safe.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.